This lecture is on oil in the Middle East and the political economy of oil more generally. So let me start off with a question that might seem a little bit strange. Are oil countries rich? At first glance, you might think, well, of course oil countries are rich. That's a stupid question. You just go to an oil-rich country like Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, and you will see lots of luxury stores, lots of expensive automobiles, lots of construction, lots of investment, lots of very nice looking buildings, and you will think this must be a wealthy place. But I want to suggest that things aren't quite so simple. For one, it's hard to measure how rich a country is, particularly when it comes to oil resources. How much oil you have depends certainly on physical scarcity, which is at some level indeterminate. Indeed, there's different measures that geologists use to qualify the oil wealth, or at least how much oil there is in a country. There's what they call known recoverable resources, and they have a slightly more uncertain measure of expected recoverable resources, and then of course there's the things we can't measure, which is all the parts of every single country that have not been explored and whose oil potential is therefore generally unknown. So what happens is that we have some idea of which countries have a lot of oil right now, but we don't necessarily know who's going to be producing a lot of oil in the future. I'll give you the example of Mauritania, which went from being oil poor to oil rich. Mauritania is on the west coast of Africa, and some ambitious drillers went and found oil off the coast, and so Mauritania went from a non-oil producing country to an oil producing country, and in the coming years will probably become a much more substantial oil producing countries as people explore some more and production ramps up. So my point here is to note that there's a lot we don't know about physical scarcity, and so whether a country is rich or poor going to be depending in part on how many resources are in there, and while we have some idea, we don't have anything like a complete picture. Second, how much oil we can actually recover depends on the state of technology at any given time. Technology for extracting oil from oil reserves underground and under the sea has gotten a lot better and a lot cheaper over the last 50 years. And what that's meant is that there have been oil fields that were thought to be completely tapped out, which are now producing again. They're producing again because new ways of extracting the oil have been found. And so again, we don't know what the technology is going to look like in the future, so we don't always know exactly how much oil we're going to be able to get out of a lot of these oil fields into the future. And finally, how many oil reserves you have, or how rich you are in oil, depends a lot on prices. It depends in prices in an obvious way, in the sense that how much money you can get for your oil depends on the price of oil at any given time. If oil is $120 a barrel, then a lot of Middle Eastern countries will have a GDP in any given year of twice that of the United States, because they're selling lots of oil very expensively, and so lots of income is flowing into the country. On the other hand, on a lean year, they might have a GDP half of the United States. If oil prices are down to $20 a barrel, then they're going to look a lot less rich in income statistics. Well, they'll certainly be receiving a lot less income for a given level of oil. So there's that sense in which oil revenue and wealth depends on prices. There's another sense in which it depends on prices. Is the sense that at one price it might be worth going to extract the oil, and another price it might not, right? So oil that's hard to get at for a variety of physical reasons usually, might not be worth getting at $20 a barrel, but $120 a barrel is completely worth going to get at. And so that means that some countries and some regions of the world will be rich in oil when oil prices are high, because companies will actually go and get the oil from there, and when oil prices are low, oil companies will refrain from doing that and will stick to the core oil fields where the oil is easy to access and fairly cheap to pump. Okay. As a country, if you do want to access more than you can produce in any given time, and this is often the case, if you're a country and you've discovered massive oil reserves, say you're Mauritania and they've discovered massive oil reserves, well, you just went from a poor country to a rich country pretty quickly, in some sense of the term. That is to say, it's like you've discovered a giant bank account. a giant savings account. Only, unlike most savings account, which you can immediately transfer to your checking account, this is a savings account that you can only transfer drip by drip, right? That is to say, you can only transfer it as the oil comes out of the ground, then you can sell it, and then you can access the money. So it's difficult to convert your savings to your checking account, so to speak. If you want to convert more of your savings account to your checking account, you have to borrow. You have to access capital markets. You have to go talk to some banks and say, hey, look, it looks like we've got a lot of oil. Will you lend us some money? We'll pay you back when the oil comes out of the ground. This is particularly true if you want to finance some ambitious development project. You want to redo your highway system. You want to redo your health system. You want to build a lot of hospitals, hire a lot of doctors, buy a lot of technology. Whatever it is you're trying to do often costs a lot more money than you can actually get out of the ground any given year. And so a lot of oil-rich countries, or so-called oil-rich countries, borrow a whole lot. Now this is a bit of a problem because, like we said, oil resources and prices are uncertain. Oil prices vary and oil resources are uncertain. Which means that in some cases you can look very rich because you're borrowing a lot, but if oil prices tank for some reason, like they did in the 1980s, you can find yourself in really desperate financial straits. After all, your banker is going to want the money back, and you may have to pump out a lot more oil than you want to pay them back, for example. Okay, So oil countries are rich in some sense, like someone who has a very, very large bank account that's difficult to access and sometimes expensive to access. What this means is that when we're trying to rank countries by how rich they are, on the one hand, we can look at their income. On the other hand, we can look at their wealth. Income is measured through GDP and GNP statistics, gross domestic product and gross national product statistics. And if you're not familiar with these, basically what they do is they aggregate the value of all goods and services that are sold in a particular area or by people of a particular nationality in a given year. Okay, so that's a gross domestic product. The problem with gross domestic products measures of oil-rich countries is that most of the goods that are sold are oil-related goods, which means that they're either financed on credit or they're financed by depleting a savings account. And therein lies a bit of the problem. When you take oil from the ground and you sell it, you aren't really creating new wealth so much as you're transforming it from a highly illiquid form, that is to say mush in the ground, to a much more liquid form, barrels and ultimately cash. Your GDP statistics does not account for the fact that you have essentially transferred money from a savings to a checking account. All it does is note the fact that money somehow appeared in your checking account. And all of that's great, but as your income went up, your wealth actually went down by an equal amount. So to say that oil countries are rich, in some sense is true. They're receiving more income, but on the other hand, they have just depleted their natural and national asset by an equal amount. And so it's hard to tell whether the country really got richer by selling its oil. It got more in terms of income, but it lost some in terms of wealth. So selling oil is less like receiving income from a job than selling stock from your IRA and putting it into your checking account. You're rearranging your assets into a more convenient form. You're not actually getting richer. And to be sure, it looks like you're getting richer because you're able to buy more, and you do indeed buy more, and it looks like your standard of living certainly went up. But of course, over the long term, it's not at all clear, particularly when we're looking at countries rather than individuals, whether we should count this form of temporary income boost as a real increase in wealth. Certainly not an increase in wealth, it's certainly an increase in income. But over the long term, the standard of living of the country, the effect on the standard of living of the country is pretty much indeterminate, and I'm going to tell you why in a bit. The reason why is that the most important variable is what oil countries do with the revenue they collect. That's what's going to tell you whether the country got richer or poorer. If the country just bought a lot of fancy stuff, if they consumed their wealth, then it really doesn't add to their ability to produce future income, which means the country really didn't get any richer. Well, it certainly didn't get any wealthier. So you see lots of fancy sports cars, but eventually those sports cars will go out of style, break down, lose their value, and at the end of the day, the country will have nothing. It will have no sports cars, and of course they will have lost the oil wealth that they sold in order to buy the sports car. On the other hand, if the country invests its resources, and if they invest it well in income-producing assets, then they're transforming a non-renewable resource into a potentially renewable resource. And that's true even if they invested in treasury bonds or other safe assets like that. So what this means is that to find out whether a country got richer on net by selling its oil depends, at least in part, on what they did with the oil. Did they transform their oil wealth into some other income producing stream, or did they just spend it on luxury goods? If they spend it on luxury goods, then if anything, we would have to say the country got poorer, not richer, as a result of that exchange. Now, economists tend to basically end their analysis there. Either states will make good decisions about oil wealth, or they'll make bad decisions about oil wealth, but the economic problem is fairly clear, and it involves three related problems. One is called intertemporal consumption smoothing. What this means essentially is that you want to even out the good years and the bad years. You do not want to start a very expensive lifestyle only to find out that you can no longer afford to as your oil resources run out, or the oil prices crash. So this is a problem about being smart about the future. And I tend to think of MC Hammer as the example of this, right? MC Hammer was a bit of a one-hit wonder, right, in the 1980s. He spent a lot of money on big houses, nice cars, lots of jewelry, and then, of course, his musical career took a turn for the worse. And what happened is that he was left with a lot of debt, and he ended up poorer, arguably, than when he started. So in order to smartly manage this influx of income, oil-rich countries have to avoid this sort of MC Hammer syndrome of spending it, and spending it, only to find out that they end up impoverished as either loans come due, or oil prices crash, or simply their reserves run out. So the problem ultimately is transforming one kind of capital, natural capital, into some other kind of capital. Capital simply income-producing assets. So one kind of income-producing asset into another income-producing asset. If you can do that successfully, then you can ultimately sustainably use oil to increase the wealth of your country. And the final problem is more direct. It's called something called Dutch disease. And I'm going to discuss Dutch disease now. So, Dutch disease. It might look like some sort of scary thing that sailors might get in a port in Amsterdam or something, but Dutch disease is simply named because of something that was observed in the Netherlands in the 1970s when oil was discovered off the coast of the Netherlands in the North Sea. And Dutch disease basically has two components to it. It has a macroeconomic effect and a microeconomic effect. And it's a disease because ultimately it causes the discovery of oil, and the extraction of oil is said to cause an atrophy in the rest of the economy. And indeed, it's said to cause long-term negative consequences for an economy. And the way in which it produces these consequences are double. There's a macroeconomic effect and a microeconomic effect. And I'm going to discuss both. The microeconomic effect occurs through domestic inflation. Inflation is just the increase in the price of goods and services. Capital and labor, so that means access to loans, right, which businesses need in order to expand, and labor get more expensive. So a country's production costs for other goods that are not oil, so say if the country produces, I don't know, clothing, or if it produces steel, or what have you, the country's production costs go up as a result of the influx of oil. This happens because oil comes in and starts bidding up the price of resources. So it says, okay, labor, you can make $10 an hour over in this industry, but we'll give you $15 an hour to come work on the oil rig, which means that those workers in some other industry are now going to be demanding $15 an hour in order to not leave. And of course, other industries are either going to have to pay the money if they do so, they're going to have to raise their prices, or they're not going to pay the money, in which case they will have to decrease their production targets. They will have to produce less, which means less income. So either way, the industry becomes either less competitive or it shrinks. So capital and labor get more expensive, and the same is true for capital. Same is true for bank loans, right? If the oil industry is promising a 10% or 15% return on investment, and the other industry, say the clothing industry, is only producing a 10% return on investment, guess where the money's going? It's going to the oil industry. So again, capital and labor will get more expensive. So a country's production costs have to go up, and this is a problem, especially for export goods, because countries' exports are now less competitive. In the case of Holland, which mostly gets most of its income through exports, through trading, that was a big problem. So a country's exports are now much less competitive because the prices for labor and the price of capital, that is to say loans, went up. The second effect is a macroeconomic effect. It has to do with currency appreciation. What happens is that if Holland or Saudi Arabia wants to sell oil, other people have to buy Saudi Arabian currency in order to buy the oil from the Saudi Arabians. Now what that means is, as demand for the currency goes up and supply, at least in the short term, is fixed, the price of the currency, the exchange rate, goes up. It costs way more dollars to buy a Saudi Arabian rial than it used to. So the currency, at least in the short term, goes up. What that means is that the value of that currency increases relative to other currencies, and this also makes their exports more expensive. So now a piece of clothing, which costs, I don't know, 5 rials to buy, now it costs you more dollars to get those 5 rials, and so it costs you more to get Saudi Arabian clothing than it costs to get some other competing country, say Pakistan's clothing. This is one of the reasons why you don't see any much in the way of manufacturing production in Saudi Arabia. So this makes exports more expensive for other countries to buy, and thus domestic producers of exports are less competitive. They sell less, and so they either go out of business or become less competitive. So Dutch disease is kind of a double whammy. Both the cost of your inputs go up, and the cost of your outputs goes up through exchange rates, leading to non-oil sector exports becoming super expensive. And so Dutch disease means a country, if it doesn't try to remedy the situation, finds it very hard to keep its other export sectors competitive when it's exporting a lot of oil. It finds it very hard to keep its manufacturing and services at a competitive global price as oil is flooding the market and bidding up the price of everything, including the price of the domestic currency. So that's, but for economists, these problems are known. They're documented, they're diagnosed, and there are solutions to this. There are ways of countering Dutch disease. For one, you try to control the exchange rate. You can do that through a number of ways. You don't have to get paid in the local currency. Maybe you hold big reserves of dollars, right? So maybe a country will simply hold lots of dollars as a currency reserve, and so they don't have to. So that decreases the pressure on the domestic currency. Another way to do it is simply to, another way is to control the exchange rate through by simply dictating what the exchange rate is, and again, mostly that will result in an accumulation of dollars. You could establish a natural resource fund. So rather than dumping all the extra money into the domestic economy at once, you start buying foreign securities. You start buying U.S. Treasury bonds, Japanese Treasury bonds, safe assets, or you could be more risky. You could buy, IBM stock. The point is that you establish a fund for the country, and you dump all the money in those funds, and what will end up happening is that those funds will accumulate money but won't be stimulating the domestic economy, so the prices won't go up and your manufacturers will still be competitive. Another thing that you can do fairly easily is leave the oil in the ground. You still have the asset there. You control how fast it gets pumped out of the ground. You don't have to get it all out as fast as you can. Now, this may not be an option for some countries who have desperate needs, but if you have a little bit of time and foresight, there's nothing wrong with leaving money in the ground, leaving oil in the ground. And finally, you try to invest the money you get wisely, the money that you put in NRFs, or if you're investing it domestically in domestic companies, then you try to invest it in, growth-oriented activities and businesses. So for economists, if governments don't put these policies into place, then they're just not very good governments. But at the end, economists have done their job to tell you what the policy medicine is, so to speak, to the Dutch disease. For political scientists, though, there's an extra puzzle. The problem is that, empirically speaking, very few countries have actually successfully implemented these policies. Have been a few. Botswana and Norway sort of come at the top of the list of countries that have been fairly successful at managing natural resources and establishing natural resource funds, at controlling their exchange rates, and all those things. So why don't governments actually implement the policy that they know will prevent their economy from becoming hopelessly dependent on the current of oil, on oil prices, right, on how expensive oil is, and destroy all the other industries in the country that are sustaining their people? And so this is where we have to do a little bit of political science, or a little bit of political economy, and figure out why these policies are so tough to put in. There are at least four major sort of explanations as to why countries do not implement these fairly simple remedies. One is psychological. It might just be that there's something about the human psychology where windfall revenues, when you get an influx of money, that it makes you short-sighted, and so all governments will just become short-sighted, or all people exposed to windfalls become short-sighted and over-optimistic. They think that the boom times will never end. They think that the price of oil will always remain high. They think that now is the time to undertake all these valuable projects. Now is the time to invest and or redistribute lots of wealth, and it just causes them to think about the short term. Then there are societal explanations. It might be that the revenue goes to people who have an incentive to stop particularly export-oriented policies. So perhaps the revenue goes to elites who control import-oriented or domestic production for domestic purposes, and they're not hurt as much. In fact, they tend to be benefited by the increase in the exchange rate and the increase in the price of goods and services. So probably less by the latter than by the former. But the point is that export-oriented, it goes to the wrong people. And so at the end of the day, you have a persistence of the policies because the interests that favor those policies aren't dominant and don't receive the oil wealth. You have state-centered explanation, which says that revenues tend to enable states to delay needed economic or political reforms. Indeed, what oil revenues do is they enable states to finance repression, war, and other welfare programs that might sap entrepreneurship and economic activity, basically putting the entire country on welfare. And people will point to Saudi Arabia, kind of like this, where everybody subsists off oil resources, which means nobody has an incentive to work very hard for a living doing anything else, and any political opposition to this can be bought off by more oil wealth. And so what ends up happening is that the state, by distributing oil wealth, ends up sapping the economic potential of a country. And finally, property rights. Well, this is probably a kind of state-centered explanation, but one thing that people have noted that oil dependence is often highly correlated with state ownership, and so it's possible that state ownership might promote sort of weak handling of the budget. I don't have time to really get into the explanation too deeply here because it's a little bit complicated. But the idea, the gist is fairly simple. The fact is when the state gets the money first, the money will be spent mostly for political rather than economic reasons. Again, leading to the short-sightedness, leading to potentially entrepreneurship sapping sorts of programs, leading perhaps to increased repression, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the political economy puzzles, if you will. I don't know if I should offer my commentary on this, but I think, the psychological explanation has one weakness at least, is that it turns out that some countries manage their wealth much better than others. And so it can't be a universal psychological thing. It's got to be the case that if it is psychological, it only applies to some people. So maybe you'd have to add a political culture explanation to it or something like that. Also, it's worth noting that the private sector, when it receives windfall wealth, it often does invest it. It doesn't immediately go spend it. It often does hold it for the future in a more rational way. So that suggests that if there's a pathology here, it doesn't have to do with the oil, but it has to do with the state. The societal explanation is weak for a number of different reasons. I think, it's not always the case that that the people who receive the oil are against exports. On the contrary, a lot of noise is made about improving a country's exports and using the oil to finance domestic manufacturing and industrialization. The problem is that they don't really work very well. And finally, I think the state-centered or the property rights approach probably holds the most promise to them, although again, the exact mechanism is probably still a bit of a mystery, the exact reason why. At the end of the day, lots of oil-rich countries have essentially spent themselves into poverty. To give you an example, Saudi Arabia is almost no richer today than it was in 1970, despite 40, 50 years of continuous heavy resource and oil extraction. The country's GDP per capita is not much better, and certainly its wealth has been sapped, which means that a lot of the resources have been spent, not invested. And this may be an issue for the long-term sustainability of the regime. Anyway, so these are some of my thoughts on oil, some of the major problems, and again, the major puzzle is why, despite the fact that economists know how to prevent Dutch disease, and why is it that countries don't do a better job of putting growth-oriented policies, such that, why isn't Saudi Arabia a manufacturing giant? Why aren't the United Arab Emirates, why isn't it a financial and banking center, for example? That's still a bit of a mystery.